So if there's a Fairfield, is there somewhere in Connecticut called Fairfield?
Fairfield?
Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson, with my co-host Emily Volpintesta and Ken Flatto, first Selectman of Fairfield.
Welcome, Ken.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
In beautiful downtown. No, it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Yes, you're welcome. It's great to have you here. So tell us about your history. How did you become first Selectman of Fairfield?
You know, it's actually interesting. It's kind of a bit of a surprise story. I had always volunteered, always helped other people, and I just found I really enjoyed it. I loved it. I was a pretty shy guy. I used to shake and sweat when I got up to speak, but I just felt really strongly about the issues. And when I ended up learning a little about our school system, about what was going on, this was the early 90s, I decided to get more involved. And the next thing I knew, people wanted to run me for office in my party. I was going to run for the Board of Finance. We didn't have a candidate for first selectman, for mayor. And I ended up volunteering to put my hat into the ring, kind of as a lark. And I ended up running a close race. So I thought, well, maybe I could do this. And I tried again, and I won. And the rest is history.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
Huh. So, any tricks in getting over that stage fright?
You know, it's funny. I tried everything. I used to practice in front of a mirror. I took a few classes. I actually, back in the 80s, with the Junior Chamber of Commerce, took a speaking class. But I actually found, very honestly, the best thing you can do is be yourself. If you just realize that people want you to be natural, usually, although my kids say I have an artificial smile. They still do. I've always smiled like this since I'm 10 years old, and they'd tell me, Dad, it's your political smile. I'm like, I've always smiled like this.
Right.
But I think if you can be yourself and just speak from your heart, then you do well in politics.
Interesting.
Hopefully.
Now, we're supposed to talk about, we've been promised that we talk about the differences between different governments, different town sizes, small town, medium-sized town, and cities in Connecticut. What separates one from the other how are they different one from the other and structurally?
Right. You know, it's a great question because Fairfield is almost at a crossroads. We thrive on calling ourselves a town, and we love the idea of being a neighborhood community, having the sense of beauty and kind of the sense of grassroots activism, but we're 57,000 people. So from a size point of view, once you're over about 50,000, most people say it's a city. Mm-hmm. And if you look at our traffic patterns, if you look at our school population, we have 16 schools, 11 elementary schools. So we're a large, mid-sized community. But we think the town characteristic gives us a sense of feeling close. And, the city concept is great when you want to talk about activity. Mm-hmm. But from a governmental point of view, the reason I like the term town is because there are more checks and balances. In our town of Fairfield, our mid-sized community, we have almost 40 boards and commissions, almost all volunteers, people that, Police Commission, Parks Commission, Shellfish Commission, Solid Waste Commission, and they all have a role in playing our town government. So instead of just a mayor and just a city council, we've got all these other people. So even myself as CEO, I have limits in my authority, and it really works, I think. It's frustrating sometimes because there are more checks and balances. You can't just tell people what to do, but I think it makes for a smaller form of democracy, and I like that.
So, rather than having more layers up and down, you've chosen, or it's happened by just happenstance, that you've got these different commissions. So you've kind of grown out laterally rather than
exactly.
horizontally rather than vertically.
Yeah, so most of our departments, we have a department head. In our large departments like police and fire, we have a deputy chief. But in truth, any citizen in town can walk into any office of any department manager or my office, and it's an open door policy. I think in city government, I worked in the city of Yonkers for 7 years. I was their deputy controller. I worked on an emergency financial control board because Yonkers had all these financial problems. But if a member of the public wanted to see the mayor, wait in line. in Fairfield, gosh, people walk in, I want to see the first selectman now.
Wow.
And if I say, I'm busy, well, what do you mean he's busy? I want to see him now. My neighbor saw him.
Right.
And so it's just a different psychology. And cities, don't get me wrong, cities are great places, and there's wonderful activity, but I think having a sense, I think the ability for citizens to connect with their government is easier in a small, mid-sized form of government. So even a big city, I think it's healthy for them to have boroughs, because at least there they can have a planning board, or they can have local representatives besides the mayor of New York or the mayor of Danbury, so I just think it works better. I love grassroots government.
Right. So have you always taken part in different forms of government? Whether it's regional government or small town communities,
I've had the opportunity, because of my background as a CPA, and I did work for 8 years in government as a professional, as a finance manager, and it was in bigger governments. So I saw that, and I saw kind of the ups and downs, and I think that gave me a leg up in managing a mid-sized government, because I saw some of the best practices, and sometimes the smaller communities don't have the knowledge, because people haven't experienced big government. So in a way, I brought some of those practices to Fairfield, but at the same time, I really I think it's important that we stay a mid-sized community. But it's interesting, you mentioned regionalism, and from my perspective, there's a real downside to it, because the more aloof government gets, if you look at the state of Connecticut, and I would bet you if you polled 10 people on the street and you said, are you able to talk to somebody in the state government? People don't have a clue who to turn to, who to call.
Exactly.
But if you say, have you been to City Hall? Have you been to Town Hall? Everybody's been there.
Yeah.
And so I think the reach of government, the broader it is, the state, the feds, the more distant people are, and the more frustrated they get. And the worst thing, the biggest fear I have about, frankly, government in America is if people get turned off too much and they distrust government, then the chance of government really, becoming, God forbid, being taken over by crazies gets more possible, because people don't care.
Right.
And when you care about your government's better.
A small portion of the electorate, I guess you're referring to a small portion of the electorate actually voting in elections, and therefore a limited number of people have, each one of their votes counts for all the other guys that aren't voting.
It's very hard. I mean, we've been fortunate. Fairfield Secretary of the State, Beislowitz, came down and gave us the Voters' Cup, because Fairfield had the biggest participation in the 2008 presidential election. It was like 91%.
Wow.
And so in our community, even for a local year, we're up around 50%.
Oh,
which
that's
is great.
So much better than any of the towns that I've
Really?
witnessed.
Really?
I've done some of the recounts in different towns. I did one in Fairfield in the Democratic primary between Clinton and Obama and the rest of them. But now, Emily lived in Italy for the better part of 8 years.
Right.
Where, as I understand, you have more of a regional government. There's more connective tissue, if you will, between towns and other towns around them.
Well, each region will have a capital city. Like if I lived in the Marche region, and then Ancona is the capital city, and then you'll have the Sindaco, who would be the governor. And then there's little tiny villages, and they would have their comune, which would be more like what we'd have a municipality of what we would have in Bethel. But you'd have the big regional, and then you'd have the little villages. Is that how it would work?
To the big city make the decisions for the villages?
Yeah, I don't know, because when I lived in Ancona was a big city, but I don't know, actually.
That's something we'll have to check out and do
that's
another
something
show
I'll
on.
have to check out and do another show on, but it just made it seem like the bigger cities
had control, yeah.
But,
well, we have in our area,
Right.
Fairfield is the second biggest community in our area, but obviously the city of Bridgeport, being the biggest city in the state, by a little bit of population over Hartford, is the central business area for big business, and Fairfield has a lot of residents who work in Bridgeport, and obviously who help Bridgeport, help charities there and things like that. But there's this interesting dynamic between the elected leaders. We have meetings once in a while, and obviously a Bill Finch would say, "Oh, you got to help my city, and you got to give me more money, and can't Fairfield and Trumbull and Easton, do more?" And we have our budget problems too. And we said, "Hey, we're stretched. We have limits." We do, I think, a great job with what I call mutual aid, which is kind of like backup work. For example, if Bridgeport has a big fire and they want Fairfield's help as a backup, they can call us, we'll send a fire truck. And similarly, if Fairfield has gosh forbid, Fairfield U had a dorm problem and we had all our fire trucks there, we could call Bridgeport and ask them to send a fire truck to Fairfield. And it's worked really, really well. So the mutual aid concept, where you're sharing services but you're not running the service, so you almost do it as partners, has been pretty effective for our area.
I guess some of the go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you were mentioning with the storms that we just had recently.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Fairfield County.
I'll tell you, we had a bruiser. I mean, I don't know how tough it was up here, but we had, Greenwich, Stamford really got whacked, but Fairfield, we had about half of our town out the first day, and the second day still a third of our town, hundreds of trees. It's the worst storm I've seen in 20 years, and it was just one of those fluke coastal storms with, 30 hours of 50-mile-an-hour wind swaying trees until they broke. And the response was, everybody was stressed. So we had huge amounts of calls, huge amounts of need for callback. But what we have a rule of thumb. We kid about it. I don't know if the mayors up here and the first selectman say the same thing, but we basically take a position. You know what? The first 2 days in a disaster, the communities are on their own. By the time the state and the feds help, it's 2 days later. So we have a lot of contingency plans. We had a shelter open within 6 hours with Red Cross and town volunteers.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
And thankfully only about a dozen people, needed it that first night. But a lot of people were isolated because all our coastal streets by Long Island Sound, we had about a quarter mile of 3-foot water into the streets, up the streets past our beach.
Yeah, they've got really literally signs in the coastal areas that say emergency evacuation route, as does all the other towns. Milford, same thing. The signs that say, by the way, if there's something happens, go that way.
Right.
I mean, thankfully the flooding was only about 4 hours, so we did a voluntary evacuation on our famous Fairfield Beach Road, but we didn't have to do a full. But it was a little bit spooky.
Really?
Yeah, it was tough. So.
Why? Because you thought the town would be flooded?
Well, for example, I went down to the beach area because we were going around, and I was with the fire chief. And as we approached the beach area, he was in his car in front of me. I was in my regular car, and I couldn't make it. I almost had to turn around. I was like almost getting stuck, and I called him on my cell phone. And I said, "Dick, I'm going to flood out. Can you get me?" Right. He had the 4-wheel drive with the big truck, the big car. So he brought me down to the Penfield Pavilion, which is one of our landmarks, and the water was all around it. I mean, the water had gone under the pavilion, around the road. There was no beach left. It was that bad. Yeah. So it was a little mini event, but we like to think of it as a test because that we're going to get whacked one day with a tidal storm that'll be really bad.
Right. I guess that proves that really, in fact, in a hurricane, it's not really so much the winds that does the damage as the water. The water is the worst culprit.
I mean, it's a good combination. It's a horrible combination. And of course, around here, I know all the mayors. I mean, the utility company in western Fairfield County apparently was very erratic. I'll be charitable and say erratic. And it's frustrating because the utility can't take the live wires out of the roads. Our crews can't move the trees or cut the trees up and open the roads. So we had roads closed for 3 days because we had to wait. We didn't want anybody electrocuted. So it was pretty scary.
All the towns are like that. Norwalk had, I think, literally most of their schools were closed for a full week.
Yeah, we had schools closed one day, so we weren't as bad as that.
That's very admirable.
But the thing that's an example where you could say some regionalism is good because if we can't reach our counterparts in the other towns, we could barely be up the creek, so to speak. And thankfully, Gordon Josloff in Westport, Dick Moshe in Norwalk. I mean, we actually have seminars. I mean, we'll twice a year do practice exercises for, a disaster, for God forbid some chemical incident on the highway, and we do a lot of talking about how do we deploy our troops, our public safety, how we work together. So we like to think we're pretty prepared.
Now, for things like fires, I guess there are fire stations in Fairfield that might be closer to certain areas of Bridgeport, for example, than the closest fire station in Bridgeport. So that overlapping those concentric circles probably serve a good purpose. And I guess all the fire stations, for example, have an idea about where they're the best qualified to go next door into the other city.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the advantage to the local fire departments is that they know their streets, they know, and so their response often, they can react faster because they kind of know what they're facing. They know this is the area with 2 family houses, and whereas if it was regional, you wouldn't have that knowledge base. You call a 911 center, every telecommunicator in our town knows those streets inside and out. But we have mutual aid. For example, if, God forbid, our 911 center collapsed and had we have backup, but if it didn't work, we in Westport have a joint thing. If ours had trouble, we could send our people to Westport, they can send their people to Fairfield. And we have mutual aid where Bridgeport can send trucks to Fairfield, vice versa. But there was a fire on North Street, which is right on the border of Westport and Fairfield, and the Westport truck got there first, even though it was on the Fairfield side. And so they responded first, they were in the house first, and then our guys got there, and that's just the way it worked for that incident. But I guess the bottom line is it's communication. If you're communicating well, whether you're big or small, hopefully people respond well.
Now, do you find if you're part of a coastal town that people tend to expect these things, flooding?
Yes, but what's amazing is, I'll give you an example. The concept of property reassessment.
Yes.
Everybody goes crazy. What is this about? Well, it happens every 4 or 5 years, but nobody remembers when you haven't had a storm in a decade, and you've been lucky. People, we actually did a mailing to every household in our community 8 years ago with a flyer. Here's all the emergency numbers. We have a hotline that will give a recording every hour as to what's happening, and the deputy fire chief updates it every hour. And you'd be amazed afterwards. People will say, "We didn't know who to call," and we're like, "Gosh, we sent a flyer to you 6 years ago. Didn't you keep it in your drawer?" So you always have to remind people, and people do get complacent. Thank God we have a beautiful area. We have a wonderful state, and we have a lot of good amenities.
Right.
But people forget sometimes how fragile life can be.
Right.
And amazingly enough, relatively good weather compared to many places. We rarely get tornadoes or hurricanes or very little of incredible natural disasters. Occasionally we get little things, but it's nothing compared to really any other part of the country where you have hurricanes in Florida or tornadoes in the central part of the United States. We really don't get those too often. I guess the bad part of that might be is that, as you say, the preparation maybe isn't quite as strong as it should be.
I mean, it is certainly among first responders. I'm sure if you ask people up here, they'd say, "Hey, we're ready." But with the average citizen and the average household, and where would you go if your house, doesn't? If your house is surrounded by water, who would you stay with?
Exactly.
Just simple things like that are so important, and family planning and family. So there's one thing that besides regional government that people could take away from is just have your plan ready, know who you can rely upon, because cell phones can be out too. If the signal's lost, we learned that, God forbid, in 9/11. The cell phones down there weren't working for 6 hours.
Yeah, I know. When I was in Italy and I tried calling home September 11th and I couldn't get through, and I was scared to death.
Yeah.
I thought I'll never talk to my family again, and it's true. It's scary.
True, you have no idea what happened until you know what happened.
Yeah, there's a wonderful new service we deployed a year ago, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, called Reverse 911, which a lot of the communities have now. But if your phone service is out because you have a blackout, the message goes on your message machine. You don't get it till afterwards. And one of the things that this last storm taught us was we only reached about 40% of our households with those recordings. So we actually have been talking about, okay, do we try to get people to voluntarily give us all their cell phone numbers so we have a backup number to call? So hopefully we're going to do that over the next 6 months.
Right.
So you learn something new with every incident.
Well, certainly you won't get all of them because some people are going to say, well, I'm not going to give you conspiracy theories and all.
Right.
I'm not going to give you my cell phone number because then you'll sell it to some company.
Yeah, I know these lists stay in our police headquarters. They don't go anywhere. But you're right. People worry.
But you'll get most of them probably. You'll get enough of them so you'll gain a lot of extra coverage that you wouldn't have gotten if you hadn't taken the effort to do that.
Now, for example, in California, where they have earthquakes, people build their houses on rollers, you know. And do you tell people to, like, in the future, maybe prepare somehow? Will they build houses differently, or?
We really enforce.
Yeah.
One thing we try to do is in our beach district, which is about 15% of our town, if you take all the low-lying areas, we totally enforce the FEMA standards, and they have really harsh. You know, you've got to build your elevation, your what do you call it, the foundation 4 feet higher than the rest of town. And some people say, well, those houses look tall, but the truth is it's because of the flood problems.
Right.
So we'd like to think that the houses will withstand it, but you know, you never know.
Yeah.
I wonder, from a realtor perspective, what do you do when you've got a foundation that's 4 foot taller? I guess do you put in larger hedges around to compensate for that?
Yeah, but they don't have the basement space that the regular neighborhoods have because they can't do them in the floodplain. So they have a little more. You know, they camouflage it. There's a lot of things they can do. But
always something, yeah.
But and it doesn't. You wouldn't drive around and really notice. Doesn't.
Right.
I mean, some houses are on stilts, and you could see it if you look closely, but you don't really think about it when you're driving by. But Fairfield, come to Fairfield shop. We've become the shopping. I'm very proud of this. We've actually, over the last 10 years, become like the restaurant capital of Fairfield County.
Post Road is just amazing.
I mean, we're very
restaurants.
Angus beef and
very fortunate. You know, a lot of different ethnic foods, a lot of different culture. Great
Beaches.
theater company with live music every week, and so we really we've come a long ways in the last decade.
Yeah, the beaches is beautiful.
So the quality of life is well tended to, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, but we have, like every community. I mean, we have, one of our elementary schools has 30 languages, very diverse. So we are not a homogeneous community. There are some, some towns in Fairfield, it's just, everybody feels it's the same background. But we've got a lot of variety. It's one of the things I love about Fairfield is, we can have one street with a multi-million-dollar house right next to a cape, with a very average home. And people live side by side and get along, and it's a great community that way.
Oh.
So
ours is a nation of immigrants,
Yeah.
truly, and if Fairfield reflects that, that's a good thing.
Yeah, we like to think so. I mean, some people, think, it's not the Fairfield of 50 years ago, but I think comparatively we're still a community-based community and a lot of feeling of neighborhood community and historic roots and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And what do you attribute that to, do you think?
One thing is volunteerism. I've never worked in a place or been in a community with so many people, whether it was PTA or church temple groups, just everybody loves helping town. I mean, we have huge numbers of people that want to step forward. And so when you have a lot of people involved, they seem to care more. If you just take that time, you're as busy as people are, and you do something as a volunteer, then you end up having more of a stake in your community. And that's something, we've obviously tried to push, but it's just happened naturally over the years.
I guess nobody stood in the way of it happening, so it just happened naturally.
Yeah. It's a great place. But Connecticut, even with all the, everybody wants to complain about something,
right.
And that's human nature. But, you do look at us relative to a lot of other places. We're a small state, and I think in some ways you talk about regional government or big government, small government.
Right.
I think the fact that we're a small state, even though we have our budget problems, and I know that many of your guests are running for governor and things like that, but the truth is we're responsive to the point. In other words, people know how to complain. They know where to go. They know their state reps. They may not always get answers, but they know who to go to. And I would wager that in a place like New York, a lot of people don't know where to go. Because it's that much bigger. So, it's one of the things I love about Connecticut.
A little stronger sense of empowerment on the part of the citizens. Now, as you
hope.
say, knowing, they probably more often than in other parts of the country probably know who their representatives are. At least their state reps and their state senators.
We have our local legislature, our local council, RTM, representative town meeting. Mm-hmm. We have 50 people. So we have 50 representatives, 5 from each of 10 neighborhood districts, and with 50 people, that's like a lot of people to call, and so it kind of gives you. We're the second biggest RTM in the state, and it makes it for a lot of difficulty to get everybody together to make decisions, and a lot of different opinions. But you know what? I think it's great because somebody has an opinion about everything, and you hear every different viewpoint, the conservative, the liberal, the middle of the road, and in the end you hope you have a good decision because so many people are weighing in.
Right.
So that's kind of cool.
That's like 1 per 1,000 residents.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot of representation. And if you've got 50, certainly in a given meeting, you're going to get at least 20 or 30 show up.
Oh, no, we get
which is still
we get
a
40
pretty
to
fair
45
representation.
at every meeting. Yeah. No, we get a great turnout, and they're very diligent. And, they like telling the first selectman what to do, and that's good.
Right.
You can handle it, right?
Most of the time.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So people tell you what to do.
Oh, yeah, I kid around. When I have kids come to the office, they're like, who's your boss? I said, I have 58,000 bosses. You're my boss. Because it's my 11th year, and I thankfully have had a good run as first selectman and, really doing well, people expect me to be able to get things done because this is my 6th term.
Right.
But there are checks and balances, and we actually had a doozy last week. I came out and kind of blasted our Board of Education because they have a wonderful person they want to make a superintendent, somebody from Bloomfield, Connecticut. They made an offer, but they're offering to pay the person more than our current superintendent, who was one of the stars in the state, who had been there 6 years. And she was the 3rd highest paid in the state, so they want to offer this person more. And I'm like, wait a minute, you've got to save the town money now. This isn't a recession. You should pay the new guy less, not more. And people grumble about it, but half the people think I set the salary. So one of the reasons I came out with a press release and said, I want you to revisit this before you sign the contract was I didn't want people thinking I did it.
Right, yeah.
And I know I love education, but come on, $250,000 is a lot of money for a superintendent. So,
which I won't ask, but I suspect is probably more than the first selectman gets.
Oh, about twice.
I was going to say,
more than twice.
I knew it probably would be a little bit more. I think that seems to be the trend is that superintendents of schools do end up getting, actually, in most cases, more than the mayor or the first selectman.
Oh, yeah.
And that's okay to a point. I mean, they work hard. They, for example, they're more school employees than town employees. So I understand part of that, but you have to kind of look at it in terms of, this is a public sector job, and if it becomes this race to the top, unless you can, here's the example I give. Our average teacher may make $60,000. Well, if a person at the top of the food chain is making $200, when they get a 3% increase, that's 3 times a 3% increase for a teacher.
That's a lot of extra dollars,
and the Board of Ed asked our teachers to take no raise this year. So how can you do that and say to the teachers, gosh, don't take a raise, but here we're going to hire somebody with a big raise? So that's why I was upset. I just thought it was unfair.
Right.
And, I got a few Board of Ed members a little annoyed at me right now this week, but they'll get over it.
Yeah. Because you'd be upsetting a whole lot of other people.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. People who voted for you, so you have to just somehow keep everybody
happy. You got to try to keep most of the people happy most of the time.
Yeah, my friend Kevin Gallagher, who has a show on Comcast here, had a call-in show a week ago where he had First Selectman Matt Knickerbocker from Bethel and Mayor Mark Boughton from Danbury. And without naming any names, a phantom caller known as David from Danbury called in and asked him we'll get to that next time. This has been Progressive Soup. David Stevenson, Emily Volpintesta, and Ken Flatto, First Selectman of Fairfield. Thanks. Good night.
Good seeing everybody.